It sits on your countertop, nestled between the toaster and the coffee pod machine. A totally mundane box of modern convenience. But 80 years ago, this wasn't a kitchen appliance. It was a weapon of total war, born from the desperate, blood-soaked race to see through the impenetrable fog of the North Atlantic. It was designed to hunt, to track, to destroy. They called it the Death Ray, a concentrated, invisible beam of electromagnetic fury capable of cooking a man from the inside out before he even realized he was being hit. Today, we use it to reheat leftover pizza and pop bags of heavily salted corn. But the Death Ray never really left. The technology wasn't dismantled. It wasn't locked away in a government vault. It just got a fresh coat of white paint, a digital timer, and a new PR campaign. It's still there, hiding in plain sight, sitting right next to your refrigerator. September 1940. The sky over London is burning. Britain is standing completely alone against a relentless, devastating aerial bombardment from the Luftwaffe. And the Allied forces have a fatal, glaring blind spot: the night. Early radar existed, but it was incredibly clunky. The wavelengths it used were far too long, requiring massive, sprawling antennas that could only detect enormous formations of aircraft. It was entirely useless for mounting inside the nose of a night fighter plane, and practically blind to the periscopes of German U-boats lurking just beneath the surface of the Atlantic. They needed a miracle. They needed to see the invisible. What they got was the cavity magnetron. It was a small, unassuming block of copper, machined with precise, keyhole-shaped internal chambers. But when you pumped electricity through it, those chambers acted like whistles, generating highly concentrated microwaves at unprecedented, ultra-high frequencies. It was a quantum leap in the history of warfare. A radar system powered by a magnetron could easily spot the metallic glint of a submarine periscope in the middle of a churning, open ocean. But Britain, battered and rationing every ounce of metal, didn't have the industrial capacity to mass produce it. In a desperate, world-altering gamble, a team of British scientists packed their only working prototype, their most closely guarded military secret, into a black metal lockbox and quietly sailed for America. Their goal: hand the blueprint of the magnetron over to the industrial giant. Waiting for them in Massachusetts at a defense contracting company called Raytheon was a self-taught engineering genius who had never even graduated from grammar school. A man who understood the flow of electricity, the way an apex predator understands its prey. His name was Percy Spencer, and he was about to take the British prototype and turn it into a weapon of mass production. By 1945, Raytheon was producing magnetrons by the thousands. The technology was no longer a fragile, experimental prototype. It was the Allied forces' all-seeing eye. Percy Spencer, now recognized as one of the world's leading experts in radar tube design, was running routine diagnostics on a fully active, combat-grade magnetron inside a Raytheon testing facility. He was standing directly in the path of the machine's invisible high-frequency radio waves, a localized, concentrated field of raw electromagnetic radiation. Suddenly, he felt something highly unusual. It wasn't a burning sensation on his skin. It wasn't a flash of light. It was a strange, warm, bubbling stickiness inside the pocket of his heavy lab coat. Spencer reached in and pulled his fingers back. They were covered in a hot, brown, gelatinous mess. A peanut cluster candy bar he'd been saving for lunch, I'd say, had completely melted. But here was the terrifying anomaly. The air around him in the laboratory wasn't hot. The heavy metal casing of the machine itself wasn't emitting any thermal heat. Spencer's predatory instinct for engineering immediately kicked in. If these invisible waves could somehow bypass the open air and directly agitate the internal molecules inside a candy bar, what else could they do? He immediately sent a junior technician out to buy unpopped popcorn kernels. He placed them in front of the active radar tube. Within seconds, they exploded violently into the air. The next day, he brought in a raw egg. He cut a hole in the side of a kettle, placed the egg inside, and directed the magnetron's beam directly at it. A skeptical colleague leaned in close to observe. Before he could even blink, the egg detonated from the sheer internal pressure, covering the scientist's face in boiling hot yolk. It was a profound eureka moment, wrapped entirely in an explosive hazard. Spencer hadn't just figured out a way to build a better radar for tracking enemy bombers. He had accidentally invented a way to inject pure, unadulterated energy directly into solid matter. By 1947, Raytheon had officially patented Percy Spencer's accidental discovery. They called it the radar range. But if you think this was the sleek, convenient little box you have in your kitchen today, you are dead wrong. The very first commercial microwave was an absolute monster. It looked like a bank vault, crossed with a piece of heavy factory machinery. It stood nearly 6 feet tall. It weighed almost 800 pounds, and it cost $5,000, which is the equivalent of roughly $68,000 today. It was so incredibly powerful, housing a massive military-grade 3-kilowatt magnetron that it couldn't even be cooled by a standard internal fan. It had to be physically plumbed directly into a building's main water system, just to keep the internal death ray from overheating and melting its own circuitry. This machine wasn't built for the modern housewife, and it wasn't built for a suburban kitchen. The radar range was industrial-grade artillery. It was deployed exclusively to places that needed raw, terrifying speed, regardless of the cost. One of the first completely commercial installations was a hot dog stand in Grand Central Station, where busy commuters watched in absolute awe as their lunch cooked in a fraction of a minute. But there was a glaring, insurmountable problem. The public was utterly, profoundly terrified of it. This was the dawn of the atomic age. The Cold War was heavily brewing. The word radiation was completely synonymous with fallout, sickness, and total nuclear death. Telling a mid-century family to put a heavy, buzzing box in their home that shot invisible radar waves straight into their dinner sounded entirely less like a modern convenience and more like a localized nuclear strike on their own kitchen table. It would take 2 complete decades of engineering, a massive corporate buyout, and one of the largest PR pivots in the history of home appliances to shrink the beast down, to finally take the weapon out of the radar dish and put it on the countertop. It took nearly 20 years of relentless engineering to truly tame the beast. The heavy, complicated water cooling system was finally replaced by high-speed air fans. The massive, dangerous power demands were throttled completely down to standard household voltage. In 1967, Raytheon, having aggressively acquired the appliance company Amana, released the first truly domestic model that actually looked like an appliance. It cost $495. It was smaller, vastly safer, and wrapped in faux wood paneling to seamlessly blend into a modern 1970s kitchen. But the real masterstroke wasn't the engineering or the circuitry inside. It was entirely the marketing. The word radar sounded like a military bunker or an air traffic control tower. The word range sounded like an old-fashioned gas stove. They needed a brand new word that sounded simultaneously scientific, cutting edge, and completely harmless. They aggressively started calling it a microwave oven. It sounded precise, it sounded clean, it sounded like the future. The PR campaign worked flawlessly. The American public entirely forgot about the weaponized origins of the technology and wholeheartedly embraced the absolute convenience of the appliance. Sales absolutely exploded. By 1975, exactly 8 years after its massive domestic launch, sales of microwave ovens exceeded the sales of traditional gas ranges. By 1986, they were a staple in nearly 25% of all American homes. By the end of the century, they were nearly universal. But just as the microwave oven was conquering the American kitchen, a massive, highly classified espionage scandal exploded, threatening to drag the appliance right back into the dark world of weapons and warfare. Just as families were getting used to reheating their meatloaf in 60 seconds, a terrifying, highly classified story broke in 1976. The Soviet Union had been quietly, secretly bombarding the United States Embassy in Moscow with high-frequency microwaves. For over 2 decades, between 1953 and 1976, a mysterious, invisible beam of radiation had been aimed directly at the building from a neighboring Soviet apartment complex. The intelligence community called it the Moscow signal. To this day, nobody is entirely sure what the Soviets were actually trying to do. Some intelligence analysts believed it was an attempt to eavesdrop on electronic communications or power up hidden listening bugs hidden inside the walls of the embassy. Others, leaning into a much darker theory, believed it was an attempt at electronic warfare, a deliberate effort to subtly alter the health and mental states of the American diplomats working inside. When the story finally broke to the American public, complete panic erupted, and immediately people didn't look at the Soviet Union. They looked straight at their own kitchen countertops. If the Soviet KGB was using microwaves as a sophisticated, invisible weapon against American spies, why exactly was there a machine doing the exact same thing in a suburban home? Consumer advocacy groups panicked. Sales temporarily shuddered as fears of microwave sickness, cataracts, and mysterious cancers completely swept through the media. The FDA was forced to rapidly enact incredibly strict, robust safety standards, mandating new heavy shielding, dual safety interlocks, and rigorous emission testing on every single unit rolling off the assembly line. The microwave oven barely survived the panic of the Moscow signal. It survived because, ultimately, convenience is a vastly stronger human desire than fear. The appliance had become simply too useful, too fast, and too essential to give up. The public decided to trust the thick glass door and the metal mesh screen, and went right back to cooking frozen dinners. It was the ultimate, perfect Trojan horse. The military-industrial complex didn't just win the war, it ended up right on your kitchen counter. Percy Spencer, the self-taught genius who accidentally started the microwave revolution with a melted candy bar, died quietly in 1970. Throughout his entire life, he held over 300 massive patents, dramatically altering the entire course of radar technology and home appliances. But he never received a single royalty check for the microwave oven. Raytheon, following standard corporate protocol for their engineers, gave him a one-time flat gratuity of exactly $2 for the patent. If he were alive today, completely standing in the pale glow of his creation, what exactly would the man who tamed the death ray actually think? He'd likely stand silently in a darkened kitchen, watching a tired parent tap a digital button, irritated and entirely impatient that it takes exactly 60 seconds to bombard a plate of day-old nachos with the exact same electromagnetic frequencies that once actively hunted German U-boats in the freezing, violent Atlantic. He was a man who deeply, fundamentally understood raw, unfiltered power. And he'd probably find a dark, profoundly bitter humor in the fact that his magnificent, world-saving, war-winning magnetron is now essentially just a cheap, buzzing box that consistently makes our pizza rolls a little too hot on the absolute edges and entirely, permanently frozen in the middle. Thanks for watching Creators Arsenal. Stay curious.